Thanks very much, Antonio. Concluding there with a very important observation that religion in Tibet, or this part of the world generally, is not a unitary phenomenon, but quite a complex concatenation of lots of different levels and layers that can be teased out where necessary. Now, Andy, are you going to do the first slot? Yes, I think so, since you're there. Our first discussant, Andy Quintman. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around to the bitter end. We're nearly there, but not quite. So first, I want to share my predecessor's thanks to Ashok and Gina and wherever you are and your whole team for putting together such a stellar constellation of people. This has really been a tremendous day. It's also been my pleasure to collaborate with Ashok and Gina, together with my colleagues at Yale, Mark Turin and Sarah Schneiderman, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, in planning our own workshop, Himalayan Connections, and I know many of you will be joining us this weekend for that. So I want to just make some very brief and general comments before turning to the papers themselves. They're really wonderful, very evocative and rich papers. I'll say just a few things about them. This collection of papers, I think, gets to right to the themes that lie at the heart of this conference in general, and the idea of everyday religion in particular. That is the stuff of religious practice, whether physical or psychological. The ways in which it is created, accumulated, transformed, and discarded, and the means through which it shapes relationships between individuals, communities, and the natural world. And this is an idea that Mark Larimore and John Grimm have both spoken about, both at length and in quite some eloquent way. Religion, and especially those practices often included within the framework of everyday religion, produces stuff. And the matter that religion of religion raises the important question of just how things matter, and perhaps even why things matter. So this is part true because until the 1980s or so, and the so-called turn toward material culture in the study of religion, religion itself was often seen in direct opposition to materiality. Buddhism, in its modern incarnation, or some would put it in its modern invention, was for much of the last century believed to be a tradition largely aligned with post-Enlightenment and perhaps Protestant values, that is, rationality, universality, individual effort. It was seen as largely being defined through its textuality. It was more a philosophy than a religion. That is, at its heart, Buddhism was a tradition free from the taint of ritual and religious bric-a-brac. Now, of course, we now recognize that the materials produced through and employed by religious practices are invested with social agency and power. And as such, they're crucial for communities of religion, for religious practice and belief. But the realm of material religion and religious materiality, I think, also offer rich targets for scholarly interrogation, and we've heard quite a bit about that already today. And all of the papers in this panel, in particular, ask us to pay closer attention to and to better understand the implications of material agency and power. That is, how it is employed by religious actors, how it can affect communities, and how it transforms relationships between individuals, communities, and the natural world. So to echo remarks made earlier today by Mary Evelyn Tucker, we need studies of religious texts and communities, but we also need to understand them in the specific context of their sites on the ground. Okay, so I want to start a little bit out of order by thinking about Elizabeth Allison's paper, because I think it offers a broad and very useful theoretical framework for thinking about all of these issues. So Elizabeth begins by reflecting on the competing discourses about waste management in Bhutan, what she describes as the technocratic narratives of waste, in contrast to the more traditional modes based on Buddhist systems of knowledge and belief. And she acknowledges up front that the former, that is the purely secular programs, the bureaucratic, technological, legal, and educational, are not always the most effective in addressing the waste management problems that exist in Bhutan today. And those problems loom large, and they're growing with the acceleration of urban migration. So Elizabeth suggests that the attention to religious and cultural mores in the context of environmental policy development and management plans may contribute to interventions that reflect local attitudes and practice, and are therefore more sustainable and require less intensive government efforts. So to reflect on the different notions that people have about their surrounding environments and to suggest possible modes of action therein, she invokes the idea of environmental imaginaries, what she describes as place-specific and regionally variable conceptions of nature that shape the ways that people perceive, discuss, work, and play in nature, that reflect a community's values with respect to its environment. Now, this is a heuristically powerful approach precisely because it allows us to consider competing discourses about nature and the environment in the context of, quote, social, cultural, and ideological threads that reflect and respond to the material conditions of particular surroundings. Now, in contrast to the modern regimes for dealing with waste, Elizabeth defines the traditional Bhutanese environmental imaginary through the ritual engagement with local Buddhist deities, whether they're believed to be mundane or transcendent. And through the notion of spiritual pollution, referred to as drip, that serves as the focus for much religious activity. And these ideas should indeed lie at the center of any discussion of Himalayan Buddhist environmental imaginary. But I want to interject a note of caution here, not so much as a critique of Elizabeth's paper, but as a general comment on the way that these kinds of religious beliefs and practices might be approached. So a nuanced understanding of traditional forms of environmental religious imaginary require a similarly nuanced reading of religion in its varieties of expression. Say, the language of esoteric Buddhist literature or the grammar of tantric Buddhist ritual, as well as the geographies of sacred landscape created by those texts and practices. Buddhist tradition of the Himalaya are often discussed in the aggregate, but the language of Vajrayana Buddhism often precludes generalities. This should encourage us, I think, to look at specific texts and practices that delineate and maintain relationships between the human and divine realms, and that describe how drip or spiritual pollution is both produced and purified. It should also encourage us to look at ways in which certain texts and practices appear on the ground, trans-regionally, foregrounding not only their continuities, but also the ruptures between them. So fortunately, many of the presentations in this conference have taken up this very task, as do the other two papers in this panel, which turn us towards specific religious communities, practices, and materials to interrogate the local expression of the environmental imaginary. So Todd Lewis's paper alliteratively examines the Punya and Pap, or perhaps loosely put, the purity and pollution of pigeons as frames for understanding the relationships between religious belief, practice, and material culture, as well as the effects of those relationships on urban ecology of Kathmandu's old city. And Todd further underscores how those relationships have real-world effects on human life. To do so, he takes the useful approach of thinking about three modalities through which the religious life intersects with community. This came out in the paper, although he didn't mention it in his presentation. Thinking about religion as doctrine codified through a set of shared texts that help to create behavioral norms and a shared worldview. As an ethos, prescribing engagement with one's community and environment. And third, as constitutive of the institutions that shape communities and influence human interaction. So Todd lays out for us the urban ecology of Kathmandu's Asantol community, a landscape that should be familiar to anyone who's spent time in Nepal, a conglomeration, as we've seen, of dense settlements built up around monastic centers, Baha, deity temples, residential courtyards, gullies, rooftops, a maze of narrow lanes that connect them. But he adds to this map the traditional garbage dumping spaces, ancient wells, and aqueducts that transect them. And he further brings into relief its primary natural flora and fauna, the trees, gardens, cats, dogs, rats, mice, kites, sparrows, and the eponymous pigeons. And in laying out the schematic view of the Asan community, Todd, I think, nicely highlights the horizontal aspects of this ecology that spreads out, for example, from a temple center to a community's edge. But he also brings to light its vertical dimensions that describe a Newar urban household that, in Todd's words, float above the highly polluted ground level streets, and where what matters is preserving the upper story living spaces for eating, living, and ritual activity. And it's this vertical orientation that foregrounds the implicit social and cultural structures that determine precisely who performs the rituals in the upper reaches and who clears the refuse on the ground. Finally, Todd highlights the ways in which the creation of and activities within urban ecologies have real-world impacts on health and well-being. And here, pigeons serve as a marker for the highest aspirations of Buddhist ethos, of ahimsa, or nonviolence. Feeding pigeons is a ubiquitous activity among Kathmandu's Newar communities, reflecting this ethos of kindness toward animals. Yet, if pigeons are the target of religious practice, they're also the sources of escalating environmental and health degradation, so taking the form of a kind of rain of bird droppings or the spread of disease. So Todd presents us with a conundrum. What course of action is possible, advisable, or even practical when the activities of everyday religion exacerbates problems found within urban environments? So to answer this, he turns to an interpretive move that sits at the heart of mainstream Mahayana Buddhist tradition itself, one that pivots around the notion of upaya, or skillful action. And he turns to the beautiful poem text by Shantideva, The Way of the Bodhisattva, to determine what Todd calls a calculus of interpersonal good and karmic reckoning for householders. Now, in his epitaph, Todd places a quote from our oldest Buddhist textual source, the Sutta Nipata, against Shantideva's work, where the former has the famous line, "One should not kill a living being, nor cause it to be killed, nor incite another to kill." And in contrast, he has Shantideva saying, if the suffering of the many disappears because of the suffering of one, then the compassionate person should induce that suffering for himself and for the sake of others. So in this context, ethical action requires attention to the bigger picture, carrying out the common good and not just the benefit of individuals, whether they're human or animal. And I would just point out that this is not something that Shantideva sort of invented out of whole cloth. This really is a kind of mainstream Mahayana Buddhist view that we find in core Mahayana sutras, such as the Upaya Kaushalya Sutra, the Sutra on Skill and Means. Let me say something about Antonio's paper before we conclude. Antonio turns us to the process of Tibetan treasure revelation as a means for considering the relationships between religious texts, practices, and material culture, and the way that it informs the production of sacred landscape. And he raises the question of whether traditions of Tibetan Buddhist theory and praxis, such as treasure revelation and transmission, present an avenue for environmental sustainability. And this, he suggests, takes the form of what he calls the ecology of revelation. And in doing so makes the important observation that the indigenous formation of landscape, that is, Tibetans' own environmental imaginaries, serve as the locus for exchange between the human world and the divine, both for worldly gain and for transcendent purposes. And as Antonio himself reiterated, it's the notion of exchange and the relationality of this religious tradition that is of paramount importance. Antonio rightly calls out our attention to the ways in which revealed treasures help to construct sacred landscape, especially in the form of so-called hidden lands, or Beiyul, and mountain pilgrimage sites, or Neri, that dot the entire Himalayan corridor. But he also demonstrates a unique example of how the land itself serves as a powerful locus of religious praxis. And he showed you those really evocative images of medicinal powders, of mineral dust, and images and amulets that are formed from the soil itself that become so highly charged and powerful within Tibetan Buddhist communities. So Antonio leaves us with a final question that was echoed in all of the papers on this panel. and that is, how are we to understand the environmental ramifications of this tradition? Are the phenomena of exchange with the environment and the ecology of revelation in accord with modern conceptions of environmental sustainability? The Tibetan Buddhist community, both in exile and Tibet itself, has taken a firm stand in this regard, and you can't visit a monastery these days without seeing posters about environmental sustainability inspired by the public statements by great figures such as the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa. But as Antonio also cautions us, we should be wary of easy generalizations about the green Tibetans, a notion that Tony Huber has kind of helpfully deconstructed for us. So to understand the efficacy of an ecology of revelation requires here, as we have seen throughout the day, a careful, granular, culturally and geographically located analysis. And in the case of Antonio's field sites in eastern Tibet, in Qinghai province, I think it further requires that we consider the scales of discourse and practice. That is, how would an ecology of revelation play out within various levels of scale, from realm of community participation through larger levels of municipal and state-sanctioned policy. So what is at stake when the political structures of civil and secular society try to leverage local religious knowledge and practice for crafting environmental policy? And what would even be the implications of such activities? So thank you all.
Now, as you know, Curtis is stuck in a snowdrift somewhere, and Mike Hutt has very generously offered to come up and extemporize on the strength of what he's heard. Thank you, Mike.
Extemporize will be the word, actually, and after such a very fluent and detailed commentary on those papers, I can't hope to match that. I'd like to be the last of the day to thank the organisers of this function. I was briefly on the programme, I believe. I blipped across it as a provocateur in the last session for tomorrow, but then it emerged that I had to join the great northward migration, so I wouldn't be available. But you got me in the end. So I have to apologise for not having read these papers in advance, because I didn't know I was going to be asked to comment on them. So I can only base my very brief and anecdotal, perhaps, comments on what we've all heard. Starting with Todd's paper, actually throughout the day I've been reflecting on, particularly in the Kathmandu context, that increasingly dramatic contrast between what I think of as public squalor and growing private affluence, with a very shiny car dealer sales rooms on the one hand, and very large piles of rotting refuse on the other. It's always been there. I first went to Kathmandu in 1978, and I remember very large piles of rotting refuse then, but they were by and large agricultural refuse rather than the kinds of mixed piles that one sees now. And I mean, my children always get ill on the way to Kathmandu, unlike most other people's children who get ill after they arrive. They always get ill on the flight or in the departure lounge at London. And on our last episode of this recurring feature of our lives, my daughter Evie, who's 18, went down with mono, as I believe you called it here. We call glandular fever. Just before they came to join me in Kathmandu. And my wife spent a happy couple of days tending her in a house in actually Mark and Sarah's apartment in Dorbigat, and she was watching the neighbours and observing the fact that the neighbour was busily scrubbing her backyard and washing her clothes till it was almost shining, and then throwing rubbish out over the wall, and said, Mike, can you explain, why somebody's so concerned to keep their inside the walls so very clean, but have no concern for the outside space? And it strikes me that there's running through a lot of the discussions today, and probably tomorrow also, is this sense of the division between the private and the public in such matters, and also perhaps by extension matters of private religion and also public religion, institutional religion as well. And as a British person who's been brought up to believe that one shouldn't drop litter and so on and so forth, there's always an instinct to, or a discomfort with seeing litter being disposed of in this way that I think Elizabeth Allison refers to as dispersed disposal. So again, anecdotally, remembering walking up the Arun Valley a couple of years ago behind a group of children going home from school who were dropping sweet papers and so on as they went along, and thinking to oneself, to what would one appeal if you wished to try to explain to these children that you didn't like the fact that they were dropping sweet papers on the path, and then reflecting on the fact that actually this is perhaps the evidence of other human beings' passage through an area of jungle is perhaps comforting to others who don't wish to feel alone as they travel through an area that is seen as uninhabited and therefore in some ways threatening. One can always also reflect on the history of, when thinking about the kinds of things that Todd was talking about, the urban pollution and so on the history of older cities, and we saw an example of New York and the Hudson River earlier today, and think back to the history of London and Paris in particular in the 18th and 19th centuries, which were possibly the filthiest cities that had ever existed on the face of this earth. The resolution of those things and the development of some kind of environmental ethic is something that perhaps resembles what we might think of as civic pride, which then sort of morphs into political will and the development of municipal services. But I think the question that comes to my mind in a lot of these discussions is whether in the Himalayan context or any other, or particularly in Nepal, whether religion can be utilized as a resource in a society which is both constitutionally declared to be and also in reality becoming increasingly secular. And I think this is a kind of a moot point. In Nepal, the environment of the deteriorating environment of the Kathmandu Valley public space is generally blamed upon failures of government rather than anything else. And one would imagine, if that was the case, that therefore you would have a very, very different kind of environment in Bhutan, where you have a strong and efficient bureaucracy and a government and a constitution which is conceived as possessing at least a Buddhist ethos. And then I remembered the contrast between the kind of media representation of Nepal's Prime Minister Baburam Bhattarai, who I think it was last year, publicly engaged in a campaign of going down to the river Bagmati with a mask over his face and a spade in his hand to single-handedly begin to clean it up, and expecting the populace to follow his example in large hordes, but appeared only in sort of slightly mocking cartoons in the main newspapers, as distinct, comparable with perhaps the example we saw in the film last night in Bhutan of a large number of people seeing it as being in their interest for one reason or another to climb to 12,000 feet and break boulders to relieve pressure on a glacial lake. What one makes of that image is another matter. So I am rambling, I hope not too irrelevantly. So I haven't really done these papers justice. It's very difficult to do in such short notice. But I was just thinking just finally to refer to Antonio's paper. As he began to talk about terma as I thought he was going to, as a kind of metaphor for respect for the balance of the environment, I was wondering to myself how relevant might this be to contemporary Tibet, because one thinks of the great Turtans, the great termas, as being firmly in the past, but my ignorance was dispelled by his very interesting presentation of modern day Turtans. And I was thinking back to the things that Todd had been saying about the way in which the fact that a text exists or a practice exists or has existed proves nothing necessarily about its modern salience. But I think the point that that was made there was a very pertinent one, and one we could perhaps bear in mind for tomorrow as well, which is that phenomena and individuals such as in the Tibetan context, Turtans, in the Himalayan context, Jankris, mountain deities, are perhaps of much greater importance for everyday religion for many Himalayan peoples than the so-called great traditions of the main Indic religions, to which ritual specialists do you turn for what purpose is perhaps as much a defining feature of what your religious identity is as whether you call yourself a Hindu or a Buddhist. These practices, these institutions are much more embedded in geographies and environments than these great traditions. And on that note, I will pause. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you very much indeed for that extremely articulate moment of rambling. You certainly didn't ramble off the point, and anyway, there's nothing wrong with rambling. And this is, in fact, of course, the point that so many people have been getting at today, the dilemma of bringing religion to bear in the service of society, whether it is possible to, as it were, put old religious wine in new institutional bottles. And this is exactly the same dilemma that Rousseau struggled with in the penultimate chapter of the Social Contract, the chapter on civil religion, where in a secular society, what do you do with this energy that is religion? Can you channel it in some way to the social good? And actually, it might not be inappropriate to read a little section from that chapter, where he's thinking about the formulation of this new form of religion, which he conceives as, and I quote, a purely civil profession of faith, whose articles it is for the sovereign to fix, not exactly as religious dogmas, but as feelings of sociability, without which it would be impossible to be either a good citizen or a faithful subject. And this religion, he says, I quote again, unites the worship of the divine with love for the laws, and, making the nation the object of the citizens' worship, teaches them that service to the state is service to its tutelary God. So on that note, perhaps we can ask the speakers and commentators to come and sit up there. Mike, you rambled so articulately, I think that perhaps I think we can ask you to sit up there, because I'm sure there might be questions. And as usual, the chair can be without a chair. You can sit in Charles Ramble. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, it's probably easier actually if I can see what's going on from here. Okay, so I'm sure that that's provoked an awful lot of questions, and just unfocusing my eyes, I can see 1, 2, 3. Let's ask them in that order. 4. First of all, at the back over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Yan Yifei, and I'm one emerging scholar with ICI, and I have one specific question to Professor Allison, because I study law and economics. So I'm wondering that, as you precisely mentioned what waste management challenges in Bhutan, but I'm wondering that what has the government or any NGOs has done to face or to react to this waste management? Because, in law and economics of the environment, there has been 2 concepts. So one is the command and control, which is basically through regulation, or you can give excise the Pigovian tax to the specific pollutions. So I'm wondering, how was that practice in Bhutan? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. That allows me to expand on some things that I didn't have time to say. And in fact, a large part of my paper is just describing what the government identified as the challenge and the data that they had and the data that they needed. But that was why I ended up doing this study, was that the government was in the process of implementing the Waste Management Act. And they felt that people were sort of resistant, and they were wondering why. And to some extent, it's so it was a command and control situation where here's a new set of policies, and people and institutions need to adapt these policies. And so to some extent, it was just a problem of time. People don't change immediately. But as I discussed, I felt like it was also a deeper problem of competing paradigms. But so there was an act, there were requirements about where to dispose of the garbage and how. There are fines. There are now inspectors who go around fining people if they are littering or not properly disposing of garbage. And then there's an NGO called the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature that did a lot of public education campaigns and did theater and songs and different ways to engage people and even a winter camp to teach young children how to engage with the environment responsibly right around waste management. It was all about how to handle your waste. So if you want to look further, my doctoral dissertation goes into this in great detail. Thanks for your question.
Thank you for your wonderful paper. And Dan Smar, you from Max Planck Institute. I really enjoy your slides very much. I really want to return there. It's so beautiful. My question is that actually it's a very fundamental question. Is Buddhism green? Is Buddhism environmentally friendly? I ask these questions because what I hear from your talk, all your papers I read, and I feel it's rather the earth gods take the credits to be environmentally friendly, because the cases you present, it's a constant dialogue, the relationship, the ethics, the morals, and it's not so much about Buddhism is playing in there. And then in Antonio's case is that the tradition of Dharma, and my former colleague, Professor Saranter, he's a bone scholar. He rather claims that tradition is a pre-Buddhist tradition, not necessarily came from India. So then again, it's not a Buddhism takes the credit to be environmental friendly. So this is my question to all of you. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
Well, I can say this, that I think of any religious tradition as being multivocalic. And in fact, that's one way to define it, is it has positions on almost everything. You can turn the other cheek as a Christian, or you can protect the faith. Buddhism has passages that speak wonderfully, poetically, about the wonders of nature, being in the mountains or among trees. You can find those, you can shop for quotes that would support that. But I think the tradition was formed in a time when the cities of the Gangetic Plain were surrounded by vast tracts of jungle. And the whole concept of nature, as we are defining it today, really is not in their world. So I don't know, it's a difficult transformational pattern of thinking to say that they're green or they're not green. They assume a world that no longer exists. And so I think inevitably our culture of interpretation has to create that applicability or refute it. I think there is the potential there. If that's at the bottom, that's what I'd say.
I'll give you my opinion. The people that I worked with and interviewed in Bhutan define themselves as Buddhist, so I accepted that definition. Although some people in the capital or in Kathmandu or elsewhere would say, oh, it's just a lot of ringing and chanting, and it's not. And then they have all these deities of the earth. That's not really Buddhism at all. But I felt like if the people understood themselves as Buddhists, then there's one vernacular or everyday expression of Buddhism. So we could call it everyday Buddhism. And it's been emphasized several times that these practices look different in different places, and that context matters. So it may be Buddhism in eastern Bhutan, and the practices may not be Buddhism somewhere else. So I think I would make the pitch for self-definition and for everyday Buddhism as a practice.
Yes, well, thank you, Dan. The question is very pertinent. I believe that it's true. I don't think the Terma tradition, as I presented it, is an original Buddhist or Tibetan Buddhist creation. We have evidence that the Bön or the pre-Buddhist priests did engage in concealment and kind of hiding texts and to preserve them from destruction. They claim the traditions, traditional scriptures claim they were protecting from Buddhism. So to prevent them to be destructed and destroyed, they kind of hid them somewhere in the soil and the temples and in the pillars. So, but it's not even just a Bön tradition. I mean, the Nidhi Darshana in the Hindu tradition, and please, Indologists correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Shaiva tradition also has this kind of a phenomenon of hiding texts, and once they're revealed, they kind of empower the devotee. And the Limpao Jin in the Taoist tradition also has this kind of phenomenon of hiding and revealing teaching. So it's not just Bön, or it's not just Tibetan Buddhist, but it's definitely an opportunity to reflect on, especially in my case, on the relationship and the exchange that's been created around this tradition. And I don't claim that it's a Buddhist green or I don't know what else is green. But what I actually interested in exploring the Tibetans' conception of the environment and their idea of relationship with the landscape, because again, someone, I can't remember and I apologize, but someone did bring this up today, and I think it's important not just to impose our observations without considering what comes from the voices of, in this case, Tibetans. And so it's still an open question, and I hope that one day we'll have an answer, but it's an opportunity to begin a dialogue or a conversation, and in order to see if there's a kind of ground in these studies that would bring this up.
Can I add one thing? Is this on? So I'm thinking of Tibetan Buddhist literature. This is going back quite early on, but even as late as the 18th, 19th century, and even some modern poetry shows a deep respect for and sensitivity to and sort of understanding of nature. There's a deep kind of connection and relationship to nature. And then also it comes through not only in poetry, but also in the treatises that define sacred landscape, the texts that draw the sort of boundaries of a sacred region or a sacred land, do so in language that shows a really deep and rich sensitivity for nature as such. Now the question then is, does that make them green? Well, was anyone in the 18th century green? Would we want to make that claim? I don't know. But there's certainly a sensitivity towards nature there. I think that's undeniable.
Mike, do you want to? Okay. Next one was the gentleman in the red sweater.
Martin Rivlin CUNY in Columbia. This is for Todd Lewis. Could you contextualize a bit the relationship between the political authorities in Kathmandu and the people you were living with? Because I'm sure that this problem existed before the Bhattarai government, when the Nepali Congress was in power, among others.
You better believe it. Yeah. Well, in the full paper, and I'm sorry to say, when I was given this assignment, I decided to write up the whole paper, so I can't possibly condense it. But I quote some of the early visitors to the Kathmandu Valley who do two things. They marvel at the architecture and the beauty of the temples, and they cannot believe how just unbelievably shoddy or filthy the environment is. So I think the point of that is to say that there's a cultural problem here, or there's a cultural practice that has led to the public health problems. And Charles also rescued one of my points, which was that really across the Buddhist world, the Buddhist tradition imagines a king. I mean, in general, as a king, as the person who solves the problem of purifying the Sangha and of taking responsibility for the whole society. The problem is that the Buddhist world has almost run out of kings. And so now, what do? Because if you look at the text, almost all the advice on how to maintain a polity is directed to kings. So now, in the words of the Sri Lankan scholar H.L. Sunavaratne, he says that Buddhists are now taking on the work of kings, and he's talking about Sri Lanka. But in fact, I think everywhere that's what Buddhists are reduced to. So and forced to do. And so then the work is of culture. How does Buddhist culture now respond to this situation? We have textual resources and we have political, economic, environmental problems. And the next step to me has to be to alter the software of the society, that is the culture, and use Buddhism where appropriate. Unfortunately, in the Kathmandu Valley, to say it's a dysfunctional political and infrastructural situation is an understatement. I mean, I've been going there 32 years, and it's really, and what's happened is that the rich who can get out have now moved to the suburbs up in Lazimpat or Chhatrapati or further out into the countryside. And so the market that I worked in that was very intact in some ways as a Buddhist community of householders has now dispersed. And they're having to reinvent how their tradition works. When someone dies and they're from Asantol and they're living out past Bodha, what do? You're supposed to carry the body, but there are not many people who could do that. So they're having to rejigger their whole tradition, partly because of the just dysfunction of the infrastructure that they can't any longer tolerate, or they leave Nepal, which is, of course, a very large exodus.
We have 5 questioners lined up and only 7 minutes left, I've been informed, so if we can keep them fairly brisk. The order is going to be this. There's Nima Tashi, the gentleman in the back. Before the gentleman in the back, there is a video link question, then the gentleman in the back, somebody over there, somebody else over there, and then this gentleman. So Nima Tashi next. If we can keep the questions short and the answers fairly short as well, please.
No, I have one question for Antonio. I mean, it's a very interesting topic about the Dedong and the Dhamma. But for the master of the Osai Doji, the master reveals the secret object in one particular place, or he travel around, and he get all the valuable things at different places. And how did he get the science of these burial places in his dream, or just get it from his teachers?
Mm-hmm.
That's the question.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, he did in a traditional way. So technically, they have this connection with their previous lives as direct disciples of Padmasambhava, and so he was recognized as such, Pema Sangye, one of the disciples, and so he started to develop this enormous ability to experience visions, and slowly visions became also a kind of a channel, a connection with the dakinis, and sorry, a little bit technical, but the dakinis are this kind of ethereal figures who announce and in a way teach or send messages to visionaries, and so he received this and instructions or guidance how to reach places where there were treasures that were supposed to be revealed by him specifically, and so he did, and he traveled across different areas of Tibet, and so the signs are both the announcement from the dakinis, and then there are also visions where he actually sees the places where he has to go, and so when he reaches the area, he identifies them, he remembers them, and so it's both a little bit vague and also very personal, but nevertheless, he retrieved several items between the area, I would say, Gonjo, close to Chamdo, and Nanchen, where he lived for last 10 years of his life, right? So I don't know if that suggests anything.
At this point, we're going to have a question from somebody on video link. But before I do read the question out, I've been asked to thank all the people who have been watching the proceedings. You don't know this, but you've been observed by 30 people online. So thank you to this invisible presence for joining us. The question I have in front of me is from Carlos Mondragon. Carlos, wonderful to hear from you wherever you are. I think he's in Mexico at the moment. This is what it says here. Carlos is an anthropologist who worked in Melanesia and also in South Central Tibet. The question is for Antonio, and I'll read it out. You seem to present the process of exchange as adequate conduct in exchange for terma. However, Since various parts of the environment are personified in complex ways, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the actual objects of exchange between persons and places, and specifically, how might these processes inform policies of sustainability? To sum up, the first question, expand on what is exchanged. Only adequate in exchange for terma? I think the idiom of exchange is very fertile.
Well, thank you. Carlos?
Carlos.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for the question. Yes, very pertinent. Had I had the time to indulge a little bit longer, but in my paper there are certain items that, I don't know if I should look at the camera, but I feel uncomfortable. But there are certain items.
He's probably gone to bed by now anyway.
Still early.
Yeah, anyways, there are certain items that are considered, that the treasure revealer is supposed to replace. And I'm one of the persons I talked to, Trashi Gensen, one of the guys with this funky hairdo, and he actually produces sort of little, they call it bumze in Tibetan, which is kind of a vase of sacred substances that, blessed and consecrated with appropriate rituals, becomes a precious item that is supposed to replace the treasure once he retrieves it. Otherwise, Osel Dorje also replaced, the older Lama that you saw hopefully in the slide, also replaced it with personal items. And I don't know exactly what he used, but there is an attempt to replace it with something consecrated, that themselves consecrated, because they have the power of recreating these precious objects themselves, not identical to the statues or texts they retrieve, but definitely of a similar or equal value. And so the idea is to refill the space that has been emptied by retrieving the treasure with something else and sealed, so that the mountain or the place where the treasure protector, in Tibetan Tersung or Tirdak, is supposed to live, in order to maintain this kind of ideal stability that has secured the treasure for a millennium, basically. And so that's this is the idea behind the replacement. Now, in terms of okay, I guess I hope that's a sufficient answer.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks, Antonio. Gentleman in the back, at last.
Thank you for your presentation, Bob Larrick. I work with the UN mental health community, UN mental health and NGO community on these issues, also an Interfaith Institute. And I wanted to ask, what's wrong with our politics and religious state and scientific state that we can't deal with these issues and build a platform of better understanding and a better politics to move on these issues more effectively? What's wrong with, since you speak about identity, thank you, I'm supposed to go to a mental health function later. What's wrong with our identities and egos of supremacy that we can't work together for leaving our children a better world and a culture of mutual respect and consideration? And what rules our lives from a mental health perspective is our unconscious and consciousness, and don't we need to develop better consciousnesses where we can work together as in greater compatibility and perhaps the understanding of our where we came from, and better science also of our Father, Mother, Creator, God, universal soul, and the need to leave our children a better world on earth as well as ourselves.
Thanks for the question. In view of the shortage of time, I think we're just going to have one delegate from the panel to answer that one. Good man, Mike.
That's a huge question.
You're regretting it now, aren't you?
Yes. What is wrong with us? Well, define our terms. Who are we? We're talking about the Himalayan situation. I mean, I think we all live in. I don't know how to begin to answer this one.
I have
okay.
not an answer at all, but a very, very small note of hope, because you pointed to so many of the aspects of environmental degradation and economic collapse and social disorder that we're all very familiar with. So I just want to make a personal plug. My university, which is called California Institute of Integral Studies, has launched a new graduate program in ecology, spirituality, and religion that is exactly trying to get at the questions we've been discussing and the larger context that you just pointed to. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to have any answers tomorrow, for sure, but we are inviting graduate students to come work hard on these issues. So I want to make this public plug to come and join us in San Francisco, which is a very lovely city, to work on these issues.
Elizabeth, thank you for giving us all.
What about new professors?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Thank you. I've got a specific question for Elizabeth, and that is the statement of the King of Bhutan that he wants was a gross national happiness. Now, did he say anything specific about achieving it, particularly in view of the fact that it really is, I would say, discriminating against the large number of Nepalese within Bhutan? And how does he deal with the question of monetization versus cleanliness of water and the cleanliness of natural resources?
On the issue of Nepalese, I would like to refer you to Michael Hutt's very excellent book, Unbecoming Citizens, right?
You're on video.
Yeah.
Yeah, with my name in front of you.
Oh, thanks. But as far as gross national happiness, it is a policy that is being enacted, and there is an arm of the government called the Gross National Happiness Commission that is, it used to be the, I don't remember, but something like the Sustainable Development Commission. And it's charged with trying to understand how to take a statement that is gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, how to take that brief statement and develop it into policy. And they've got 4 pillars of gross national happiness and 72 indicators, and they do surveys throughout the country to assess how people are doing. And what's really interesting is that this idea of gross national happiness has been taken up by Western countries, France and England and Canada. And here in the U.S., there's a group in Vermont called Gross National Happiness USA. So I think that it responds to the previous gentleman's question in a certain way. This is a way of looking at how we're doing as human beings that doesn't reduce us to homo economicus or homo economicus, or whatever it is. Sorry, long day. It says that we're more than economic human beings. It says that we have desires for connection, for spirituality, for art, and for a healthy environment. And so, as I said, a number of other countries and states have taken up this idea, which I think is very promising.
And I think that's it. Perfect timing. Thank you very much. I'd like to, and before I hand over to Gina and probably, Gina, certainly first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to our speakers and our commentators for a very enlightening afternoon. And thanks also to the audience for these very stimulating questions. More tomorrow. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Dr. Charles Ramble for his great service as chair and for keeping everything so cohesive. Thank you. You did a wonderful job. Just a few announcements. So yes, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.